morning, everybody, and welcome. We're just waiting a couple more minutes for all of those who've registered to gather in the room, and then we will formally get proceedings underway for this morning's webinar. So if you bear with us for no longer than about another 90 seconds, we will get things underway.
So we've seen the numbers go up. It was a bit disconcerting a few minutes ago when the numbers went down. The numbers are 145 at the moment. It's that rush as people start logging in.
I see we've got people from all over the world: Indonesia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Germany, India. Fantastic to be joined by so many people from so many different parts of the world.
Somebody from Manchester as well.
Fantastic. Proof of
somebody's come all the way from Croydon. You see that, Dominic? Croydon, so that they'll have good reception.
I hope so. And good morning and afternoon to people from the UAE, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka.
There's a chap there, Arjun, who I've been in touch with on LinkedIn. So good to see he's come in, man, true to his word. And there's Heather. You see Heather there? She's our marketing lady. She's making sure that I don't say anything wrong. It can get us into trouble. So it's like having a head teacher watching. So best behaviour. Morning, Heather. I'll probably get into trouble for that. Good to see colleagues joining as well. Or Cambodia. Oh, and Alistair Tyler, that's my boss, he's on as well now, so that even better behaviour. So yeah, we're almost up to 200 now. We're just.
I was going to say, as the numbers just tick over 200 at 3 minutes past the hour, let's get things formally underway. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today for the 5th London Institute of Banking and Finance's series of 6 webinars relating to our trade and transaction banking qualifications. I'm Dominic Broom, Executive Consultant at LIBF, and will be moderating today's webinar on trade-based financial crime. The purpose of this morning's webinar is to give an overview of LIBF's Certificate in Trade Finance Compliance. During the session, we'll be running a series of audience polls, and there will be a brief quiz at the end of the session. Please do use the chat box to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll address these at the end of Alex's presentation. We would, however, kindly request that you chat to friends or colleagues who've also dialed in offline in order to keep the chat box free for those Q&As. I've seen from the webinar registration list that we've got people joining from many different parts of the world. But feel free to tell us which country you're joining us from via the chat, as some of you have already done. A particularly warm welcome to those of you who I've met in person over the years, proof that trade really is a global family. Those of you joining us today will be eligible for 1 CPD point. Please keep a screenshot of your participation to keep in your My LIBF log. We'll also be sending out a link of a recording of this webinar at the end of the event, and the CPD credit will apply as well to those watching the video. Today's presenter is my colleague Alex Gray, Head of Trade and Transaction Banking at LIBF. Alex has a combination of experience in technical trade finance, trade operations, financial crime, and anti-money laundering, and he's a member of ICC UK's Financial Crime Subcommittee. He's lived in 9 different countries and travelled on business to a further 31 during the course of a distinguished career. Alex most recently spent 3 years at Santander, 2 of which were as an international director, where he was part of a team responsible for growing the trade and working capital business throughout the international trade origination team. Prior to that, Alex spent 26 years with HSBC, where he served in positions of increasing responsibility around the world, living and working in countries including Canada, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the UK, culminating in the role of Head of Trade Services. Before I hand over to Alex and get the presentation underway, as you will have seen, we have a couple of initial questions for for the audience, the first of which is up already on the screen. So we'd love to know where you are all joining from. And you can see the choices: Europe, Middle East, Asia, Africa, Americas, and Oceania up there on the screen. So we've now 251 participants, and by my ready reckoner, we've had about 150 responses to the poll. If those of you who have yet to put a response into the poll would like to do so, I'll give us another 10 seconds just to get a flavour.
Nobody from Oceania, Dominic. Nobody from Oceania is today. Too late in the day for them.
Oh, you say that, Alex, and we get one. Oh,
well, that's the idea. That's the problem.
Good, good. Well, I think
there you go. There's one. Thank you for your commitment.
We will end that poll and take that record with us. Very useful information, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. And the second poll we'll put up, please, and they're coming onto your screens now, I hope. Just a quick one around what sort of role you are currently in. Are you in trade operations, sales, product, risk and compliance, or another type of role? And answers to that poll coming in thick and fast.
Well, it's good to see we've got people from risk and compliance joining us as well.
Absolutely. Critical partners on a day-to-day basis in the field of trade finance. I've always, in my own professional career, worked very closely with risk and compliance partners, obviously to ensure the best possible delivery of service to the client. So, as you say, Alex, great to see now almost 30 individuals identifying themselves as risk and compliance specialists joining the call.
Okay.
Well, I think we'll get underway. For those recently joined, and I think we've probably had another sort of 30 or 40 joiners since I began. Just to recap, the purpose of today's webinar is to give an overview of LIBF's certificate in trade finance compliance. During the session, we'll be running some more of these polls, and there'll be a brief quiz at the end of the session. And for those looking to ask questions, please use the chat box, and we will address the questions in order at the end of the session. And as said a little earlier, if you could kindly restrict use of the chat box to Q&A purposes from now on, that would be greatly appreciated. It'll help us to address those questions at the end. And without further ado, Alex, I'm going to hand over to you to run through your presentation.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you very much. Slightly strange for some that have been watching the last 4 webinars to see me now actually as the speaker and not the host. And also they might notice a different background. I have moved apartment and there's no Wi-Fi, so I've come to my friends at homework in Putney. I have a shared working space, and they've got it all sorted out with screens and social distancing, so I'm very glad to be using their meeting room, so thanks to them. Apologies for the bit of glare from the very good lighting they have here. Also, as a Scotsman, I'm told to have an accent, and if people start speaking quickly, and that might be because of the subject matter is one that I'm very enthusiastic and passionate about, so just use the chat box if I'm speaking too quickly. I'll try and speak as clearly as possible. Anyway, as Dominic mentioned, today we're looking at exploring the trade-based financial crime. I first started coming across this area when I was at HSBC, when I was a group trade training manager. Much simpler time in the 1990s, where most of our training on this subject matter focused on fraud and piracy. But then, of course, I don't know if you've seen this at the FCA thematic review. Bank control of financial crime and trade finance, that came along with a number of other reports, and made it a lot more work for us. Just to quote some of the things, there was one of the findings was an inconsistent approach to risk assessment. So that's where people in Oxford have had the experience of things growing Also a comprehensive training program. So I worked on that at HSBC with developing a program for all of corporate and commercial banking. But I used the title Exploring, something that never stops. Financial crime is always evolving, and we'll talk about that in a second. So just to, sorry. So CTFC, as Dominic mentioned, the Certificate in Trade Finance Compliance, and as the latest of our program level 4 qualification. And the core text in that is a book called The Trade-Based Financial Crime Compliance, an extensive book, over 400 pages, published by our good friends at the Institute of International Law and Banking Practice, IIBLP. And it's supported by an interactive module delivered by Coastline Solutions, who are also our good friends. I wouldn't want them getting jealous that I didn't say they were friends as well. So we're going to look at a kind of broad overview of the subject matter. Now, when you're doing the actual training, you'll notice there's a series of animation. We're not doing that today. Buyers and sellers, feel free, if you're ever looking at it, to give these people names. They're obviously working in the world of trade. One of the things that is difficult today is with gauging the audience. So that's why we took the poll earlier. We see that there's people in ops and in compliance. I'd just like to ask a question. We've got a poll come up for ROTS of the people who are in trade. And this is a slightly cheeky question, and apologies to our people in compliance, but I feel when I worked in trade, I felt sorry for the people in compliance, because sometimes they were thrown in the deep end. Maybe not so much now, but I feel that a lot of people in compliance haven't got a full knowledge of trade. So what do you think, in terms of the people you deal with in risk and compliance, what percentage do you think have an appropriate understanding of trade finance? Now, the reason why is, as I say, I feel bad for the people that compliance thrown at the deep end. Then also, to the other side, there's the people who are in ops who have to explain things to people in compliance. And it's good to see that some people are saying 100% as well. Looking at the general consensus, people seem less than 25%. I've always found that people in compliance know a lot about compliance, but they might not know specifically about the actual subject matter. And the reason why is it gives me when I go to speak to various banks, I can speak to them about this poll. It sort of backs up my overall thought has been over the years, and I really want to help those people in compliance. And it's good to see that some people have signed up today. So thanks very much. Thank you, Rox, for that poll. Very useful data. Also keeps everybody awake. Well, at the end of the day, so there's people out in Asia. Okay, so what is financial crime? Now that's a question for you. Are you thinking about it? Everybody has a view of what it actually is, but it involves the misuse of the financial system for improper ends. The trade finance principle produced by the Wolfsburg Group, the ICC and BAFT, defines it as by stating that financial crime refers to money laundering, all crime including but not limited to fraud, tax evasion, human trafficking, bribery and corruption, terrorist financing, and the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. So a bit of a mouthful. What we want to stress here is about the work that goes on behind the scenes. So the people that we find that are in ops seem to be very modest about the work that they're doing to prevent financial crime, and also the people across the whole board. Current estimates is that crime raises about $2 trillion in revenue, and a business sector, it would be in the top 5 of all business sectors. Within that amount, is about half of that is related to counterfeiting, which of course is a major, on the trade side, there's the risk of counterfeiting. And it's just not the kind of things like handbags. This is even more relevant to things like we've seen recently with pharmaceuticals and recently PPE equipment. I think people in trade are too modest and they don't realise how important their role is in combating financial crime, protecting innocent people and innocent companies. I remember in my experience when I was at HSBC congratulating one of my team for finding a fraud that would have lost a customer £60,000. And they were kind of very embarrassed that I was praising them. They were just saying, it's just doing my job. One of the things I would like is that people understand that the work that they're doing and how important it is. And why this is also a fascinating subject is as I've delved into it, you know, I've only got about 10, 11 slides today, but as you delve into it, as you will also do with the reading material that we have, there's other subject matters that come up as you, what is really a fascinating area. Of course, you know, on the financial crime side, there's the regulatory and reputational risk side, and there have been a number of fines across the board, which a number of you have protected the banks against. I'm not going to give out any examples of any names of banks because many of you are our customers and I just wouldn't want to embarrass, not appropriate for this point in time. So, financial crime regulation. The point about financial crime regulation is to understand what is driving that regulation, where it all comes from. So in that respect, if you have an understanding of what is driving things, you can prepare for the future, as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction when something just comes in. But also, having an understanding of why something is there enables you to also explain it to your customers. Now, remember, once again at HSBC, a number of times when we were at the forefront of the work that was being done, there was a number of times where customers say, well, another bank is not doing that. And we would have to say, apologies, we're having to do this, and I think you'll find that other banks will catch up. Most of the banks are caught up on this level now, but it's something that's been driven by regulation. So financial crime regulation is a response of governments and the private sector to financial crime, and it addresses a number of crimes that have increased dramatically in recent years. And there's multiple layers to the regulation, and you will all have examples of, so you've got the lawmakers, the regulators, and the bank examiners. That's on external to the banks. And then, of course, the organisation compliance personnel and the general management, all influencing and shaping the regulation. Within also, there's the regulators, but also different authorities that help. And one of the things I wasn't so familiar with was the Egmont Group. I don't know if you've heard of the Egmont Group. In the UK, if you have a suspicious activity, you file a suspicious activity report, an SAR. And what happens is that goes to the National Crime Agency. So the Egmont Group is a body of all the national crime agencies of different countries get together to discuss how financial crime is being shaped, try and stay ahead of the criminals. Those are kind of those names like the Egmont Group, you know, the Wolfsburg Group that we mentioned previously. They're the people that came up with the whole concept of 3 lines of defence. All these different parties and names are highlighted in the training that we're talking about today, but it's very difficult to cover off in a space of about half an hour. So, in terms of types of financial crime, you know, I think with the audience, I wouldn't want to go into too much detail at the moment because it would take you could do an hour on each one. But of course, money laundering. No, and also related to money laundering, I don't know if you wouldn't expect this to be a movie critic scenario, but if you ever have a chance to look at The Laundromat on Netflix, The Meryl Streep from last year, that was very, very interesting. It covers off some of these whole aspects of financial crime, especially money laundering. So terrorism financing, sanction violations, so that, you know, of course, includes, you have different levels of sanctions, the UN sanctions related to, say, North Korea, whereas you have other sanctions, say, against, say, Russia, for example, they would not be from the UN, they would be from either the EU or the US. That's because of, in the EU, you have the permanent members of the UN Security Council. The 5 of them are China, France, USA, UK, and Russia, of course, and Russia. So with those 5 members, they will never pass a sanction on their own selves. So that's why it moved down a different level. So you have 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and have a power of veto on the sanctions. Next one, in weapons of mass destruction, of course, on bribery. Now, well, that's very relevant to what situation we're experiencing at the moment. But interestingly enough, Transparency International, I don't know if you've heard of them, but Transparency International, if you get a chance to look at their website, you can literally spend hours on there, the great work that they do. In March 2019, they published a report entitled The Ignored Pandemic, which is rather ironic with what happened a year later. And they talked about the $7.5 trillion spent globally on healthcare. 500 billion is lost to corruption. I worked that out last night. I couldn't get a calculator to do it. I had to put it on the computer. That's 6.5%. 6.5% is lost to corruption. So it pervades in health systems, and that's the kind of work preventing that kind of bribery and corruption going to assist with the overall good that the people in banks are doing. So bribery, and then commercial fraud. One of the ones I tended to see is on people having their emails hacked, so the suppliers' emails being hacked and giving instructions to the buyers to remit funds to a different account, and that can maybe you've experienced that type of thing. And then the violations of anti-boycott prohibitions. Now, in terms of extra work, I've got some homework for you if you want, because we haven't got time to go into every case study. But if you look at the example, Chonggang, I'll hold that up. It's a very high-tech thing. Chonggang. That's some homework for you to do later on. Look it up. It's not a Netflix movie at the moment, but it could be. It has all sorts of things going on. So it's a North Korean vessel going through the Panama Canal, and it got stopped, and the captain attempted suicide. It was a shipment of sugar, but it was concealing a hidden cargo. So I'm not going to, that's like the trailer for you. So have a wee look at that. Very fascinating as to what was going on there. That is a very, very good case study. So that's, once again, I'll just talk Chonggang. And of course you can see it in the, we'll do sending out a recording of this later. Okay, so I do have there's another crime of a financial dimension. So I've got a poll for you actually, related to that. And once again, just to make sure everybody's paying attention, there's 2 polls related to this subject matter. So of these types of financial crimes, which is the one area that takes up most of your time, as in suspect and requires further work? Okay? Because I'm going to ask another question in a second, but this is not about actual detection and things you've seen, but what takes up your time. I'm not surprised with a high number on sanctions, but it's interesting that you don't see much on the bribery side. I wouldn't have seen that from my experience. Not much on the terrorism financing. But on the trade side, money laundering and sanction violations. So we've got over 300 participants now, so we'll give it a couple more seconds to get more than half the people in the room answering that, so thanks very much. So money laundering and sanction violations, I think we can, Roxy, I'm going to end that poll. So that's interesting. Money laundering and sanctions seems to take up most of your time. I would definitely agree from my experience of various op teams over the past few years, that would be the case. We'll look at the next poll, which relates to that. So think about what you just said, but of these, which is the area that you have seen most of, what's actually happened, or you prevented, or not just suspicion? So what have you actually seen or prevented? Yeah, that's interesting. So, number of sanction violations. Some of those maybe inadvertent as opposed to deliberate things, like the chap from the UK golf club who was exporting batteries to Iran, or the super gun. Some of them are inadvertent where there's not a knowledge of that type of thing. But that's the same. That kind of would go along with what I've seen on the commercial fraud side. So these are things that you've actually seen, and there's some other ones, anti-boycott, but not very much on the weapons of mass destruction. So, but thanks very much for that. Just good to see that my thoughts are backed up there. Okay, so in terms of you have those are the types of financial crime, and what we do is we've sort of put those into various categories. But then in all of spotting them, you have to have like a red flag. Now, we know the term red flag is often called as an indicator of financial crime. It refers to data, documents, activities, and other points of reference that can point towards the potential occurrence of commercial crime. So that's the actual definition. What I did when I was at last year, I was delivering some training to Santander on financial crime, and I used a whole load of different points. I got data from FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Hong Kong Association of Banks, Wolfsburg, and FCA, to draw up a list of different types of red flags. So just to cover some of those off just now. So we have on the customer side, what's one of the ironies there is when somebody is being rather aggressive because they want something to be pushed through, and they're offering to pay high fees potentially. And I'm just going to cover off some of these. There's the documentation side. Future data bills of lading, documents have been reused. I saw a case recently where there was a bill of lading with a colour photocopy and had a chop on it to try and pass it off as an original. That type of thing on the documents. And then they're on the payment side. So all these characters, by the way, you would see in the training from Coastline. So on the payment side, it's a case of where are the funds coming from, an unexplained change to the payment instructions. Remember I talked about that before. Request to pay to a third party. That's what most banks will not do that anymore. To pay to a third party, because not only could it be potentially a fraud, but it could also be on the tax evasion side. Then there is the actual transaction that's happening. So involvement of high-risk jurisdictions, sanctioned entities. Often if the number is an around amount or a very high amount potentially. All these, you will know a lot of these yourselves, but they're put into 6 categories. The shipment, which are the routes that it's taking. So that's a case of use of Chonggang was through the Panama Canal, but it's a North Korean vessel, so it involves tracking of the vessels using the Maritime Bureau, and then also in the use of commodities. The cases that I've seen over the years where there's potential suspicion often involves commodities, whether that be urea, sugar, oil. But that's not to say, of course, that as bankers we're not handling those types of transactions. Ironically, in all my years, so until I moved to the UK 10 years ago, so 20 years in banking, all the urea and sugar deals that I'd ever seen were not genuine. But then, of course, in the UK, we're handling a number of major corporates, and then I started to see real sugar deals. The deals that I'd seen in the past come to smaller companies who couldn't really handle that type of thing. So those are all, the red flags, and of course, you'll know many of them yourselves, and each bank will probably have a list, but it shouldn't really be seen as a total checklist. It should be that overall tracking feeling of suspicion. And then if you have suspicion, refer it up the line to your colleagues in various, whether that be in compliance or to your own manager. In terms of every webinar we've done over the past couple of months, there's always a reference to COVID. I mean, that's why we're doing webinars, is because we're not in the office. We're seeing a lot more attempts at fraud. So the GTR, Global Trade Review, and I believe some of them are joining us today, so thank you to them, highlighted this in a recent piece that Interpol, in investigation, they arrested 121 people in March for having dangerous pharmaceuticals worth €13 million that were seized, alongside counterfeit medical devices such as self-testing kits. So there's a lot of fraudulent activity going on around COVID. I've seen myself, somebody was asked, came to me to say about a deal where they were being asked they could potentially make a good profit, but the factory in China was wanting an advance payment. Now, where they hadn't wanted it in the past, my concern was there, advance payments with could be an issue. Of course, advance payments are still used in trade, but this person had never dealt with this company before, so there was concern there. So COVID is heightening the element of risk at the moment, and that's partly because people are not in the office sitting beside each other, being able to show them various documents. You have a document, you show it to your colleague, and that's something that the criminals are taking advantage of. So, in terms of what we cover in CTFC, I've gone over a very, very small part of it. There's the trade aspect, and this is for people who are maybe on the compliance side and don't know so much about trade. And then you have the financial crime regulation works the other way around. So for people in trade who don't know so much about the regulations, so there's a compliance program, exercising due diligence, and then the indicators of trade-based financial crimes, so I've covered some of that off in the very brief time we've had this morning. When you're doing it, there's various exercises, so very, very useful to check on your learning. There's fact finds, so that's that interesting self-study I talked about, when you go into it and you find other things out. And what I thought was quite useful was that there's a glossary of all the terms, but also a whole list of abbreviations used in financial crime. So you've got AML to WTO. There's no Z in financial crime, but there might be, but I don't know one. But in our glossary, it goes from A to W, W being the WTO, World Trade Organization. So in the training, there's ways of keeping your test to make sure you're learning through the way. So, and then in the part two, so you have that thing about where the crimes, and then part two looks at combating financial crimes, steps to stop the various different parts that we talked about. Okay, so in conclusion, I just want to talk about the fact that this is a difficult time that we're in. It's an unusual working environment, and there are not those opportunities to go and speak to your colleagues quietly. I would say that although I think people are becoming more familiar with using the technology, and hopefully they're feeling that they can speak to people, whether that be their colleagues in compliance and vice versa, or raise things up the line. You see, the thing is that the crooks are taking advantage of this situation, and there might even be some that are actually watching this, if not right online now, but watching a recording to get some tips of things. So what I would say to the people there is that the people that are in trade are standing against it. Now, excuse this, as a proud Scotsman, I was trying to look up we talked about the Wolfsburg Group and using that 3 lines of defence, and many of you are that first line of defence at the banks. And I looked up the word first line of defence, and I got some American football, but as you can see, we don't have many people from America on the thing. So as a proud Scotsman, I wanted to use this image. This image. This is the thin red line. Now, apologies to if there's anybody from Russia joining. This is from the 19th century, so quite a while ago. But a as a Scotsman, this is something that it's actually in the National Gallery of Scotland, but I think it's a great show of strength by showing people working together, standing as the first line of defence. So apologies to any Russians out there but this was a long, long time ago. So that's it from myself. I think what we've done in the past is that with the Q&A, that's really where we get the fascinating questions. First, but before we do that, so I see that there's people writing in the Q&A. That's great stuff to see. We'll look at the exam questions. I've even used another icon from the actual training. So the exam format is there's multiple choice questions, and I would also suggest to people that if they're doing the exam to make sure that they leave enough time, and if they get stuck on any one question, to move quickly to the next one. We just got an example of a couple of questions. So Rox, I don't know if you can bring the first one up. Now, sneakily, I haven't actually haven't covered this in my discussion today. So just a little cheeky one for you there. So which of the following represents an attempt at international standardization in respect of international trade transactions? INCSR, Incoterms, NACHA, OECD. So we've got 325 people around, so give them time to unlock their screens. See if we can get at least half the people to answer that. Okay, thank you. So the correct answer is actually B, Incoterms. These are international commercial terms stand by the ICC as their attempt to standardize international trade. Dominic, I don't know, do you know what INCSR actually is? I should have looked that up. But do you know what that is?
Call me out there this morning, Alex. I will look it up.
Okay. Oh, I've got myself out actually. So the next question, thank you very much for that. So just gives you an idea of the kind of questions. The next question I did cover today, so we'll end with a positive note. Well, hopefully you're all paying attention. Which of the following is a control mechanism recommended by the Wolfsburg principles? Know your customer, ongoing scrutiny, third-party due diligence, and 3 lines of defense. And so this is a control mechanism. I did actually say this twice during my talk. And the Wolfsburg principles, of course, they're all of the recommendations that banks have adopted. And to put you out of your misery, whilst it does talk about know your customer, so but in terms of the control mechanism, it talks about the 3 lines of defense. So the answer is D there. But I can understand why people would think it's know your customer, ongoing security, and third-party due diligence are all things that you should be doing. But in the Wolfsburg principles, it looks at a specific control mechanism. Okay. Thank you,
Alex, the answer to the previous question was the International Narcotics Control Study Reports.
Okay, so that's why I wouldn't know anything about narcotics, so that you don't feel so bad about that. Okay.
So we've had a number of questions come in.
Great, and I've even got a special, look at that little visual aid, and people asking questions.
So
we asked them to.
Loads come in.
This is the thing, we've got 20 more minutes. That's why my talk doesn't last long. So I'll let you get on with that, Dominic, and see what you've got for me. Although, let's say us, because I'm sure you know a lot about this. If I'm struggling, I'm going to go to you as my wingman.
To help. So we're asked, what's our opinion, or your opinion, particularly this one, Alex, on the effectiveness of price checking in the prevention of money laundering?
That's an interesting question. So price checking, it's where do you check the price? Because obviously some prices have dropped. So we're looking at money laundering, over shipping, under invoicing, that type of thing. some. So what was it? Where was the question again? It was about
the effectiveness of price checking. I'll chip in if you would like. I mean, it goes beyond just simple price checking, in my opinion. I mean, first and foremost, any trade transaction, does it look right and does it look sensible? But there was a fantastic example about a fantastic, if criminal activity can be deemed that, but a very good example, perhaps a better way of putting it, a year or so ago that I saw, where paper straws were being air freighted from a South American country to a West African country. And everything looked right. The price of the consignment for the paper straws, which is obviously a very cheap goods to produce and indeed to purchase, were all absolutely correct. And from memory, I think the price of the consignment of paper straws was about $10,000. But the air freight charges, as I mentioned a moment or so ago, these were being air freighted, were 3 times the value of the paper straws. So one needs to ask oneself the question, in that case, why on earth would such a low value good be being air freighted? And unfortunately, in that particular example, those sorts of questions were not asked. All of the required and standard checks around the transaction passed. And it was only at the very last minute when I believe a compliance officer took a look at the transaction at the bank in question and said, is this really sensible? That further due diligence was done and it was found to be a cover for money laundering. So, great example of does it look sensible? Do all aspects of the transaction look sensible to me?
And that shows how the criminals are staying ahead, because they know that prices are being checked. They try to get around it by inflating the price of the freight. So that's an excellent example. Thank you. What other ones have we got there?
So another one, since banks only deal with the documents, every time we're not able to catch the red flags in documents such as pricing, generic goods, and other descriptions mentioned in the documents, what are top tips for us to combat money laundering? Well, I think we've already mentioned a couple there with that last example, but any further thoughts on that one, Alex?
Well, the main thing is about, you're looking at your documents, but one thing that relates to the last exam question about why a lot of people answered KYC, know your customer. So you're looking at your documents, but how well do you know your customer? Have you been to visit them? Have you got a feeling for what their actual business is? That's research, not only just about the documents, but know your customer. And that's why a lot less banks are handling things that just come passing through. They want to know their customer very, very well. And I would say once you do that kind of research, that would really help. You talked about the asking questions and how they are actually asked. Some people, if they're volunteer, if they're providing information, but if they're cagey, that gives that another aspect as to why you're being suspicious. One of those things that we talked about, the red flags, is that people sometimes get upset because things are slowing down and they get irate. You feel like saying to them, well, actually, I don't. You can't tell them. But another red flag is that the fact they're getting irate is a red flag. But I would say know your customer not only from meeting them for lunch and going to their offices, but get around all their facilities. Get to know their suppliers, and then you should have a much better understanding from the AML side. And
never be afraid to ask questions. As you're mentioning there, get to know your clients, and if all of a sudden they are dealing in different goods from what you've seen them deal in before, and possibly there might be different consignment names or different names in terms of members of the company or purportedly members of the company dealing or authorizing those transactions, get on the phone, get on the email and ask questions as to whether that's legitimate. In my experience, I've certainly seen cases where perfectly legitimate companies who'd been dealing in let's say rubber shoes, all of a sudden transactions started coming through for other types of commodities. Questions were asked, And, whilst the company was continuing to trade completely legitimately, rogue members of the company or people associated with the company had started to make what looked to be trades affected by that company, which had absolutely nothing to do with them. And it was by checking and asking the question as to whether ABC Corporation really was starting to deal with consignments of rice when they'd always dealt, as I said, with rubber shoes, for example, that a fraud and misuse of trade documentation was unearthed.
There's an interesting question there from Nizam Chana saying, can we gather information from customs for open account transactions to control money laundering, as 80% of trade is made on open account? This is actually something that's discussed about the information sharing, because in an ideal world, the more information that is shared between banks, but not only between banks, but also with the various parties within the trade ecosystem, the better, the easier it is to actually stop financial crime. Some countries are more open to that, some are not, and also the technology supports that. So that is really where some of the aspects of technology are coming in to help. But I think one of the questions is sort of from Nizam is trying to make the point about it would be a good thing, because it would be. That's the thing, is that the more information that is available, the more easy it is to stop financial crime.
So we've had a number of questions come in around use of technology and digitalization helping to combat trade-based financial crime. Any thoughts on that from a sanctions or a money laundering perspective, Alex, as you've seen? As I said, a number of questions come in around how technology can be brought to bear in this field.
So I don't know if some people may have listened to a podcast that we did with Chris Southworth at the UK ICC. And that was just before the shutdown in the lockdown in the UK. But he was talking about actually the one benefit that could come from the whole aspect of lockdown is that it accelerates the trade digitization agenda. And you know about this, Dominic, as well from the work we'll see with the ICC. The more that, so there are a lot of programs are being accelerated to move because there's been a lot of problems because everything is paper-based at the moment. There's also, on the doc checking side, the ability to check things using a number of companies. There's one that I've worked with in terms of being open to Trade Sun, but there's also Trade Stream and Content. All these are doing doc checking, so they're digitally checking the documents. They don't actually physically need to be seeing them. And that can help with the whole aspect of AML and sanctions side as well, because they can link into various databases. But the more that is done digitally will make it easier and less, and make it more difficult for the crooks. And then there's the whole aspect of blockchain. I've seen on the word blockchain once or twice on the chat. That is something that a lot of banks are working towards as something that will help a lot. And blockchain is definitely something that will hopefully impact the world of financial crime and making it less easier for banks to keep control and more difficult for the crooks. So I think that with the positive aspect of the whole aspect of lockdown is the ability to move the trade digitalization agenda. Dominic, are you involved at all with that side on the ICC, the trade digitalization aspect?
To a certain degree, and as you said, blockchain, I believe, as there becomes more widely adopted in terms of processing of trade transactions through the sorts of platforms that you were mentioning there, Alex, is going to be a great facilitator in this domain, because one will be able to detect if there have been attempts at changing documents at any point in their life cycle. I would also say that already over the last 20 years, there's been sort of huge advances, certainly from a sort of sanctions screening perspective, in terms of, sort of use of automated processes within trade operations to, pull out what we all know as the red flags, as you were referring to earlier, so that sort of a double check can be done on vessel names, ports of embarkation and discharge, etc., just to make sure that nothing could be potentially contravening any sanctions. And those systems are already very sophisticated. But we've had an interesting question come in related to this about what are the general practices to disguise shipment to sanctioned countries. And I would say an example I've seen in my career is potentially where shipment of materials is being delivered to a port in a non-sanctioned country that happens to be very close to the sanctioned country, and it's not particularly clear in terms of documentation as to where the final destination of the goods is intended to be, and sometimes that can be a red flag that is worth investigating a little further. Alex, you've seen
that's a good point. So like for North Korea, it could be Russia or China, and then also for Venezuela potentially, Brazil. So it could be shipping to the border that is close. And what's interesting is of doing these various webinars, I've never seen so many questions come in. Well, that's great. It also means we've got a lot of work to do today to get through them all, because we're not going to be able to get through the remaining 7 minutes to get through everything. So just to tell everybody, we will be getting through these later today. Could actually be tomorrow as well. A lot of very, very good questions. I don't know if you can see any more there, Dominic. It's a case of just handling them on the hoof, but I promise you we will get back to everybody.
Another topical one I know thought has been given to. Good question here. Banks have got strong KYC processes in place before facilities are set up. Are there any weak areas to consider when dealing with supply chain finance or demand guarantees in particular?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. On the demand guarantees side, so when we had the training at HSBC, it was a full day training, and at the end of it we were asked to actually put ourselves in the shoes of the criminals. And I think that is a very good exercise for everybody that is on the more homework for them to do. Think about what you would do if you were a crook and how you would do something, whether maybe money laundering or the number of other financial crimes. And generally, a lot of us thought about using demand guarantees, setting up fake companies, probably a service company, and then making a claim, and that enables illicit funds to get from one country to another. And that's the whole thing. We talked about the Russian laundromat. They used demand guarantees to launder a whole load of funds, and if they were ever somewhere through Moldova, and if they were ever brought things to court, they had already paid off the legal system as well. So demand guarantees, I have always thought that could potentially be used, and has been. And on the supply chain side, the case of it goes down to the KYC piece here about on the supply chain programs. They tend to be done for companies that are better known, but it's about who are the suppliers and also the buyers. In case of doing more of that KYC, it used to be previously that things were onboarded very, very quickly. But I think nowadays there's a lot more care and due diligence done on that because of this very issue.
And here's another one coming from our friends at Ishbank, and I've got an opinion on this, but I'm sure you do too. Alex, conducting single buyer factoring disclosed to the buyer, should you consider the seller or buyer as the bank's client?
I'll let you handle that because I haven't actually seen it written down, so you can go with that one because I need to see it. You go for that one.
I would say in the context of what we're discussing today, in terms of combating trade financial crime, one should be looking at both aspects of the transaction. Obviously, technically, one is dealing with the seller, but I think one has a duty, as with all trade transactions, to look across the whole trade chain as much as one has visibility over it, and to ask sensible questions about the propriety and sense of the transaction that one is dealing with.
That's a good point, because there are various things. There you go.
Sorry, we have a couple of questions, perhaps, sort of as we're approaching then, specific to the qualifications. How is the CTFC final exam? Does it cover topics from outside the textbook?
No, is the answer, because that would be a bit sneaky. So with all our qualifications, they are kept up to date, and then we maybe have amendments, and then if there was amendments there, we would always tell the people whether they would be included in the exam or not. So we would never put in anything that wasn't already covered in the material. I suppose that was maybe. So the two exam questions I had, one I didn't cover in my material today, but they're both in the material that we do in the study, with the online covering the publication as well. So yeah, good question. We're not in a habit at LIBF to try and catch people out. All our qualifications require a lot of work, over 200 hours of self-study, and that's why they're proper qualifications. And the exams are not by any stretch easy, but we do not want to catch people out.
And here's another question, again, a number of questions coming in related to sanctioned entities and countries.
Mm-hmm.
Should we carry on with a transaction where a vessel called at a sanctioned port either before the transaction or after the transaction, in terms of the point-to-point shipment in question?
That's where you've got a problem there, because so maybe your actual vessel was going from, say, Hong Kong to Singapore, and there's no issue with there, but you're talking about the fact that your goods going Hong Kong to Singapore, maybe they went via North Korea by some reason on the way there, and that has an issue. So I can't, at this moment in time, I wouldn't know the exact answer with that, and that's also a lot of these rules changing. I would say that's where you would go to your people in the sanctions team would have a view. And that's the thing, sometimes we just have to go and speak to our other colleagues and find out the view. I don't know what your view is, Dominic.
I mean, I certainly think if there was evidence prior to the transaction, or the purported point of loading of the transaction in question, significant questions should be asked. Obviously, if it comes after the apparent port of discharge, again, I would be seeking to ensure that we had absolute confirmation of the fact that the goods that we had financed had been discharged at the appropriate port, and not by any means been covertly discharged somewhere else. Obviously, any vessel that is calling in sanctioned locations, heightened due diligence, and as Alex, as you were saying, discussion with your relevant compliance officers as your respective organisation should be taking place. It's a fine balance to ensure that proper commercial trade continues to take place in an unfettered manner, but simultaneously to be ensuring that for the sake of us all, the right protections and controls are in place for those that seek to misuse the financial services and trade finance systems for illicit means.
So, Dominic, I think we've run out of time, but I haven't seen so many good technical questions, and thanks for challenging us. And some work will have to be done in the next. I think it's going to take a couple of days, because we've got 31 questions asked there, of which we've only probably managed 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7, I don't know. So we'll get back to everybody, but I'd just like to say, as we're getting to the end, thanks ever so much. Dominic, you'll see that, because now as we're getting to 9 o'clock, and some people are either starting work or finishing work, so that the number of people have dropped off. They've given themselves an hour for doing that thing to get their someone to get their CPD points, as we talked about earlier. So you keep a screenshot of this and put that screenshot in your CPD log on my LIBF. So I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day now. Thanks very much to everybody for joining, and we will send out before the end of the week. We'll send out the recording and we'll get to all your questions. But thanks very much for your participation today. Great to see so many countries like within trade getting involved today. So goodbye, everybody.